error we've made is in not including the proof of service on Mr. Mani.
Yes.
But I am assured that he was served with that.
Oh, okay.
Yes, Chairman.
Okay.
Chairman, just very briefly, the reasonable explanation that accompanies the affidavit of our attorney of record is that when the legal team had a look at these papers in preparing for the hearing, we realized that though President Zuma was not directly implicated, because his name was mentioned, out of an abundance of caution, it was better to actually serve him with a notice, just in case what came out of the mouth of the witness dug a bit of a hole and showed that he is directly and substantially affected or implicated. That's the long and short of it, Chairman. You know that we have set out in the affidavit those reasons. Prejudice, Chairman, is very limited. He has had 7 days' notice. He does have an attorney who has placed himself on record. We believe there is no prejudice to him at all. And in the circumstances, Chairman, I move for an order in terms of prayers 1, 2, and 3 of the notice of motion in respect of the Ramatlhodi matter.
I grant prayers 1, 2, and 3 in the notice of motion.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, similarly with Advocate Mufe's statement, the facts are slightly different. The parties were given 7 days' notice instead of the 14 days' notice that we have followed as a convention. All of them in this instance, all the implicated persons had not been served with their 3-3 notices. So they have been given those 3-3 notices, Chairman, and it's apparent from the papers where the proof of service is. I don't know if you'd like me to go through, but with all of them, the 3-3s were served on the 21st of November, and then the coordination application was served on the 23rd of November in respect of all. In this instance, Mr. Zuma is added to these implicated persons, whereas he wasn't added to the ones whom Advocate Ramatlhodi's statement referred to.
Yes.
Chairman, again, in terms of the facts really relate to the Advocate Mufe and Mr. Mabunda trying to find each other just to start preparing the initial statements. When they eventually came to the legal team, there were a couple of gremlins which we thought might create confusion, and we decided we'd rather clean those up and put out a statement that would cause consternation for implicated parties. And that's essentially what we've set out in the affidavit, Chairman. Other than that, Chair, I'd like to point out that the legal representatives of Dr. Ngubane and those of Mr. Duduzane Zuma have indicated in letters, I have copies here if you'd like to have copies, Chairman, that they reserve their rights to approach you in terms of Rule 35 to pursue whatever rights they think they might wish to pursue once they've read the transcripts and consulted with their client. In the circumstances, Chair, if you're satisfied, I move for an order in terms of prayers 1, 2, and 3 of the notice of motion attached to this application.
I grant prayers 1, 2, and 3 of the notice of motion.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Ms. Hofmeyer.
Chair, today we have the evidence of Ms. Cheryl Carolus. Before we have the witness sworn in, there is 1 or 2 aspects of housekeeping, and then a general submission I propose to make in relation to the relevance of the evidence to the terms of reference of this commission. If I may deal with those 2 matters initially.
Yes.
Chair, in relation to housekeeping matters, I can inform you that the relevant Rule 3.3 notices arising from Ms. Carolus' statement were issued timeously, and in respect of those 3 notices that were issued, there have been no applications for cross-examination.
Okay.
In terms of sketching the relevance of the evidence today, Chair, as the legal team has it, there are 4 broad aspects of relevance in Ms. Carolus's evidence today. The first of those relates to setting the scene of the state of South African Airways at the time that Ms. Carolus took over as chairperson in 2009, and the state in which she and her board left the airline in 2012. We submit that story as of critical relevance to the work of this commission, because what Ms. Carolus's evidence will show is the extent to which, in that period of 3 years, that board made substantial strides in turning around SAA, in getting an effective management team in place, and in the course of those 3 years, resisting external pressure and undue influence in relation to the management of the entity. It is critical to set that story because the evidence that will be led in due course when the details of the SAA position after this board's resignation in 2012 is presented will show how this board's plans to rescue the airline, to take it forward, to ensure good governance and appropriate management systems being in place, then came to naught. And so the first important aspect is the setting the scene for the evidence that will come.
Okay.
The second important aspect is what Ms. Carolus can tell us about the Mumbai route. She's both a corroborative witness there in relation to the evidence that's previously been presented by witnesses, and she takes that story further.
Yes.
The third aspect are the indications of the pressure that was placed on SAA to place its advertising spend with the new age, and the extent to which that was resisted by her board and the management that were in place. And then finally, to deal with the events surrounding the mass resignation of 8 members of the board, which Ms. Carolus chaired at the end of their term. That event itself shows, in the words of Ms. Carolus in her statement, what seemed to amount to events of a constructive dismissal type, which would pave the way for a more compliant board.
Yeah.
So, Chair, it's against the background of those 4 areas of relevance that we present the evidence of Ms. Carolus today. If I may request that she be sworn in.
Yes. Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
My name is Cheryl Carolus.
Do you have any objection making the prescribed affirmation?
No, I do not.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please state, I truly affirm.
I truly affirm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carolus.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Chair, for the purposes of the record, I propose that we number Ms. Carolus's evidence bundle R, as I have it is the next in the sequence.
We already have R.
Do you already have R?
I seem to think we do have R. I may be mistaken.
As I have it, we concluded on Q yesterday,
Oh, is that
so
so?
R would be the next.
Or is P that we have P? Maybe,
Indeed.
maybe P looked like an R to me.
P snuck its way in. Today we have R. So if I may propose the...
So this will be the bundle that has got Ms. Carolus' statement will be marked Exhibit R. Thank you.
And then just to orientate you, Ms. Carolus, in terms of what is in front of you, you have a copy of R, and there is also a copy of another evidence bundle, N2, to which I will make reference in the course of your evidence. Ms. Carolus, I understand from our discussions previously that there are 1 or 2 aspects of your statement which commences at page 1 of bundle R, in respect of which you would like to make corrections. My proposal, Chair, is to deal with those corrections as we reach them in the evidence, because it is useful to place them in context.
Whichever, that's fine. If it's convenient to point them out at the beginning, that can be done. If it's more convenient to deal with them as we reach the particular aspect of her evidence, that's fine. So it's fine.
Thank you, Chair. My proposal is that we do it as we reach them in the evidence. Ms. Carolus, if I could take one of your, of Exhibit R, which is the first page of your statement, and if we go in that bundle to page 29, can you confirm that that is your signature on page 29?
I confirm so.
And that this is the statement that you prepared from pages 1 to 29 for your evidence today?
I can confirm that too.
Thank you. And but for the two corrections we'll come to, do you confirm the contents of that statement as true and correct?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. Carolus, if we can commence your evidence today with the background that you brought with you when you commenced as chair of South African Airways in 2009. Can you sketch for us where you came from and what you did before you entered SAA?
Thank you, and good morning properly, Chairperson.
And good morning, Ms. Carolus.
And to the House.
Thank you.
I want to just start off by saying that I believe I'm part of a very lucky generation of people in South Africa. I'm old enough to have lived through all the horrors of not only institutionalized but legalized racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. I grew up under a system of apartheid that I think was neo-fascist and that really thrived on hatred and division. And being old enough to have lived through the full horrors of that and still seeing the consequences, I am very determined that I will never allow history to repeat itself on my watch. I am also old enough to carry the scars of having been an active participant in the struggle to end apartheid. And I carry those scars as a badge of honor, the scars of detentions, of torture, of banning orders, of numerous forms of restriction. But I'm also very proud to be part of a generation who's young enough to build a very different future for my country. I was born to poor parents on the Cape Flats, who were the first generation of families who were forcibly removed under the Group Areas Act. And I saw the consequences of that, and much of that is still prevalent in my community and indeed in our society. I joined my first political organization at the age of 13, and it was really the only way that a young black angry girl child could counter a system that sought to make me complicit in my own oppression. I spent my entire teenage years, and indeed my adult life, consumed by militant participation and defiance of apartheid through protests and through building organizations, democratic organizations, much of which remains still today. I have held leadership positions in student organizations and in the women's movement during the years of apartheid. And like many South Africans, I was inspired and drawn and given hope by the politics of the ANC of building a South Africa that was non-racial, non-sexist, and democratic. I served in the leadership of the United Democratic Front, which was an alliance of anti-apartheid civil society organizations during the years the ANC was banned. And at the unbanning of the ANC, I was elected onto an interim leadership of both the ANC and the SACP when those organizations were unbanned. An element of huge pride for me today still is I was elected to be part of the ANC's first delegation that met with the then President de Klerk and his team to discuss how we would go into the talks about holding talks in South Africa. And I should say, Chairperson, the enormous pride I felt at the time of being part of a delegation that was so diverse and so much, represented so much of the vision for the future. On our side of the table, and it was literally a table led by by Nelson Mandela, was a group of black people, white people, young people, older people, women, men, Christians, atheists, Muslims, Jews. And the other side of the table was a group of very aged white men from very similar backgrounds. And it's a moment of great pride for me because it represented where we wanted to take our country. I was also part of that process of the team who did the negotiations. And I remember so much, and often when I feel disturbed about what's going on in our country, I get very angry with people still who say our country is worse than it was under apartheid, because it is not, even at the moment with some of our concerns. Because I remember a time when we were straddling negotiations and where tens of people were killed just routinely every day in our townships as we were negotiating. I remember the murder of Chris Hani, someone I was very close to and respected deeply, and his family. I remember how we had to pick up body parts of people who were slaughtered on trains every day. I remember Boy Patong and how I was part of the ANC leadership who had to go in there after that massacre and the rapes of women in households that those soldiers moved through. And so it was with enormous pride and achievement that Nelson Mandela was sworn in, and that we were associated with his example of enormous integrity and humility with which he served our country. I was one of a small group. In fact, I was the only member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC who decided to not make myself available for any parliamentary positions.
I'm sorry, just repeat that. I didn't.
I think I was the only National Executive Committee member of the ANC who actively decided to not stand for any parliamentary positions. But I'm at great pains to say I then and still remain very, very concerned about who runs our country in Parliament, because it is such an important role of trust that people are entitled to or given. So whilst not in formal parliamentary service, I, over a number of years, served in a number of functions to help government, and mostly unpaid functions. I served on a commission with the First Minister of Education to look at what happens with our higher institutions. I've served in a number of capacities in chairing South African National Parks Board, and I can go on and on at both national and provincial level of various ways in which I've supported our government, our newly elected government, to navigate that space. I've also served in a number of non-governmental organizations, particularly in the areas of young people at risk, such as Soul City, Love Life. I have served in organizations of biodiversity. I served at the international boards of WWF and WWF South Africa, and feel quite proud of how we've transformed those spaces. I also serve on international body dealing with international conflict prevention. And I can say that I feel honored to have served in organizations associated with the fights around HIV and AIDS in our country when people did not have access to those. I've also served in organizations that deals with gender violence, and have been a strong voice around rape, including that of our former president, when many people were scared to do so or felt we would be compromising the ANC. And I must say, Chairperson, I'm deeply disturbed by the events over the past 10 years or so in our country. And initially, I think we were quite, and I used an analogy once when I wrote an open letter to then President Jacob Zuma, of the toad in the pot syndrome, where there's a candle burning under it, where you just adapt and you adapt your levels of tolerance until you finally realize you've reached boiling point. But also, I must say, Chairperson, that I do think that there was a very strong view amongst us as ANC members of we would harm the organization and by implication the country if we spoke out. So I was part of a very august group of people that I am very junior in, calling themselves the stalwarts and veterans of the ANC, who made presentations over a period of about 2 years to the leadership of the ANC, to in fact say that to express our concern. And it fell largely on deaf ears by the then leadership of the ANC. But I was also proud to have been part of a handful of ANC leaders who, at the court ruling, the Constitutional Court ruling on Nkandla, felt we had to speak out on the steps of the Constitutional Court. And many people were quite critical of us doing that because they felt we would harm our organization that we loved so dearly. I hold a very different view. I believe that I'm in the ANC because I believe I want an ANC that can serve my country and not serve itself. Because the freedom that we have today to vote and to have a constitutional court and a constitution came at a huge cost, and that it's a matter of luck that we are here. So I believe that we were perilously close to an abyss, and that there's much work still to be done, and which is why I am here today, Chairperson, to in fact participate and share my learnings and experiences in the hope that as a nation we can just realize how much work there is to be done and how perilously we actually took our country back to the brink of the abyss. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for what may be called an opening remarks. But basically what you were doing is you were telling us more about what you have done as a South African over the years in your life to make a contribution to the country, and what you have said is quite important. So I must thank you once again for coming forward to give evidence. We really appreciate it. You have touched on an issue that is important, namely that when certain events were happening in the country, there would be a view within the ruling party held by some that maybe speaking out on certain issues would harm the party, and that some might feel that they should not speak out publicly, and that you hold a different view. Now, it may well be that that issue is still there in relation to certain people coming forward to assist this commission. It may be that there are past and present cabinet ministers, directors general, and other government officials who have knowledge of information that would be very useful for the work of this commission, but who are not coming forward to assist the commission and assist the country because they feel that they may be harming or would be harming the party. I would have thought that an organization such as the ANC was established in order to bring about a certain type of South Africa, and that therefore the country would come first, and that if you are going to speak out in order to make sure that you contribute to ensuring that the country is on the right path to where it should go, you should not have a problem, and that nobody should have a problem with that from the ruling party. So what you have touched on is very important, but I just hope that more and more people who may be staying away from coming forward to assist the commission, look at this and reflect on whether the party wasn't established in order to help the country to take a certain direction in order to create a certain acceptable society. And that if things happen in the country which seems to have the result that the country deviates from the right path, they should come forward and contribute to bringing the country back to the right path. So thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Hofmeyer.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Carolus, if we can go to page 1 of Exhibit R at paragraph 2. You talk there about your initial appointment to the board of SAA as chairperson on the 28th of September 2009. You were appointed together with a number of members of the board, and you traverse who they are over the page at page 2. What I'd like you to give the Chair a sense of is the levels of skills, expertise, and experience amongst the board members who were appointed with you in the course of 2009.
Thank you very much. As I said, I think there was a lot of thought that went into it, and I discovered subsequently a lot of people who served on the board with me all felt equally strongly as I did at the time when approached by Minister Hogan that we would only do this because of our love for our country. We understood SAA was on very shaky grounds, but we would also only do that if we felt they were the right people, with the right reputations and the right levels of skill. And maybe if I can just go through ourselves, I mean, as I said, my own background is, I've had the privilege to be able to speak for myself a bit. I can also just say that I had served in other capacities. I had served as South Africa's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, which is one of our most important missions. I do think that I can say, at the risk of sounding immoderate, that I think I did a reasonably good job in raising South Africa's profile, in building our trade, in building our people-to-peoples, and so on. Upon my return, I was the CEO of South African Tourism, and I'm very proud of the fact that we turned it around quite significantly, and particularly to turn it into a proper sector. And that meant working with all the stakeholders, including, of course, South African Airways, and aligning the work of tourism with that of trade and industry, with that of our foreign relations, and indeed the role of our national carrier played a very important role. So I got to understand that quite a bit. I'll just go through the list just so that I don't skip over anyone. Ms. Hogan put together, there's a person, Mr. Abel Bouchon, who subsequently resigned in midterm for no other reason. He lived in Chile, and it just became a bit of a nightmare, but he stayed with us while we were in the formative period of it. Mr. Bouchon had been a CEO of the Chilean national carrier. He was at that stage the chief executive of Coca-Cola in Chile, and had served on a number of big companies. Mr. Teddy Daka, and you're right, people's resumes are far too small. He's in fact an accomplished businessman who owns businesses that are global, and in fact one of his businesses deals with the defense industry and manufacturing parts for components for the aircraft used in defense industries. Today his company is one of the largest black ones listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, some of the things he's associated with. Mr. Tukela Jantjies is in fact today still he heads up a very successful rural dairy farming project out in the Eastern Cape. He had, what's not in his CV is that he was actually a shop steward in his life, and in fact was the chairperson of the Boksburg Civic during the struggle years, but had gone on and got into management and HR functions. Ms. Yake Kwenana is a chartered accountant, and is in fact had a company, Kwenana Associates, which is still existing, and she had served on a number of government bodies and so on. Ms. Kwenana, as I said, was a chartered accountant with degrees in computer science as well. Mr. Russell Loubser, at the time, was the CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which, as we know, had, I think, for 8 years running, won the best award for the best run stock exchange in the world, himself a business person, and served in a number of capacities there. Mr. Bonang Mohale, at that stage was a member of SA Express, which Minister Hogan in particular, and those of us who served, felt had to create better alignment with SAA. He was also quite an important person in the whole sphere of marketing and communication in South Africa. And he was the president of Shell, South Africa at the time, and served on a number of other business capacities. Ms. Duduzile Mieni, Ms. Dudu Mieni, herself was somebody who was the chair of the Jacob Zuma Foundation at that stage, had done quite a lot of community associations that she was associated with, and was in fact somebody who was studying in the field of administration and had been a teacher, but had also served on a few state-owned entities and their boards. Mr. Jabu Ndlovu was at that stage the executive for Microsoft South Africa, and was quite a seasoned people and skills development person, and had for a few years then won for Microsoft South Africa the best employer to work for. And at that stage there was the situation at the staffing level was very fractious and quite bad at South African Airways. Advocate Lindy Thomas was a practicing advocate in the court, and in fact a seasoned commercial lawyer and somebody working in the field of litigation. Mr. Louis Rabetz had done quite a lot of work in the field of forensics and corporate governance, and particularly in the areas of risk. It served in a number of both government, but also big corporates like Sanlam in those capacities around risk, and he comes with actuarial science qualifications. Mr. Zakeli Sitole was late today, also chartered accountant, was one of the first, I think one of the first 8 black chartered accountants that qualified in South Africa, and had served, done enormous, the most extraordinary civil service right up to his death. He had served, at that stage he was still serving on the audit functions of the Treasury, the PIC, and in fact universities and so on. There was Ms. Margie Whitehouse, who was a marketer of note, and in fact herself had very good qualifications and experience in that work. Worked for some of the top global and South African companies. And then there were a few other people who joined the board, one of whom was Mr. Dave Lewis, who's not in the list of that we have, I think. Mr. Lewis had in fact served as a leader in the trade union movement throughout the 80s, and in fact built the non-racial trade union movement, but he had just retired at that point as the head of the Competition Commission in South Africa, and as you know, that was one of the areas where there was a lot of problems for SAA. I think I've covered everyone. I'm not going to cover the executives because they were employed for their skills. Maybe what I can just conclude with, Chairperson, is to say that Minister Hogan appointed initially 9 of us, and then in discussion with myself as the chair, and me in discussion with the rest of the board, as we realized what the challenges were that was facing us, we subsequently, she then appointed members like Mr. Lewis, who was clearly seasoned when we realized the quantum of the challenge that we were dealing with, hundreds of millions of rands worth of litigation in the areas of competition, and some very bad practices in that area.
Thank you.
Okay, before Ms. Hofmeyer continues, I'm just checking that people at the back are hearing everything. There are nods. Okay, thank you. And then, Ms. Carolus, I seem to remember that you didn't mention it, but I seem to remember that at some stage you were also the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, am I right? Or were you the Secretary General?
No, you are correct, Chairperson. I was the first woman elected into the top 5 leadership positions in the ANC, and I did indeed serve with great pride at the time of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo. Yes, thank you.
Which years were those, by the way?
Oh, now you've actually got me. I stepped down in 98, and I had served for 4 years before then. And I served as the deputy to Cyril Ramaphosa. He was the Secretary General and I was his deputy. And when he left the ANC to pursue business interests, I took over up until 1998 as the Secretary General of the ANC.
Okay, no, thank you. Then just lastly, although Ms. Hofmeyer will be asking you the questions, you are telling me your evidence. So
My apologies.
look at me.
I shall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Carolus, at page 2, paragraph 4, you give us some insight into the role as Minister Hogan had it and as you implemented it at SAA between the shareholder, the board, and management. Can you explain to us how you saw the distinction between those roles and the emphasis that Minister Hogan placed on those different roles?
Thank you, Chairperson. Minister Hogan, when she approached me to serve as a chair, she basically asked me if I'm prepared to sign up to her understanding of corporate governance, and that is the separation of those three areas of responsibility in relation to the airline. And she saw herself very clearly as the shareholder representative who would set a clear set of outcomes and shareholder expectations with us. And she outlined various processes that we would follow to make sure that there was clarity of understanding between herself as the shareholder representative and ourselves as the board, who would then take responsibility for the areas of governance. And that is, we would oversee the development of policy and of strategy and of implementation thereof, as well as the monitoring of the performance of the company and the management in its role in leading the team to achieve the objectives that our shareholder had set for us. She explained to us very clearly that she would hold us accountable, in fact, to those matters. She then convened a workshop of all the chairpersons of all the state-owned entities under her jurisdiction at the time. And one of the important things that stood out in my head was the notion of progressing what used to be semi-government departments or state-owned enterprises into state-owned companies. And I just remembered it was one of those things that stood out, and that she expected us to adhere to the letter and the spirit of all the pieces of legislation and practices that governed the state-owned companies and enterprises in general, such as the PFMA, but also that she expected us to be familiar with and to execute and to legally operate within the framework of the newly adopted Companies Act, which had come into force in 2008.
Thank you. If we then turn to page 4 of your statement in Bundle R, you capture from that page and the following the challenges that SAA was facing when your new board took over. As I have it, you identify 5 different challenges in the course of the next number of pages, and I'd like to take you through each of them. The first that you identify is a governance failure within SAA. Can you explain to the Chair what that was when you found SAA?
Thank you, Chairperson. Well, there was quite a bit of violation around just straightforward illegal activities, violations of the PFMA, violation of procurement process, of tender processes, and there were, in fact, also there was an investigation which our predecessor board had just done, which identified a number of those breakdowns and failures. And that investigation was conducted by KPMG. And when we arrived, we were informed that we were bound legally to, in fact, review and act on those shortcomings. So we had a script of events that was already detailed for us. We reviewed it on, the report had just been produced. Our predecessors had not yet had a chance to fully act on it, but they had suspended the previous CEO on whose watch these violations and transgressions had taken place. And so we came there was no CEO, and there was an acting CEO at the time who was a member of the executive. And so we then set about acting on that. As a consequence, we were advised to, in fact, lay criminal charges and a number of civil actions to retrieve the monies that we believe were misappropriated or negligently spent at a management level. When we received that advice, all of this was quite new still, and the NPA just was also quite new, and Mr. Menzi Simelane was in fact the head at the time, and not clear how to do this, I personally called him and sought his advice for how we should go about bringing lawful action. And he then advised us that charges should be laid with the with the Commercial Crimes Unit, and there was some, I think even he was quite new to the whole procedure, and there was questions of domicile and so on, but ultimately charges were laid. And I must say, when I was compiling my presentation, it suddenly occurred to me that I don't know what happened to those charges, and they were pretty serious charges, both because of the precedent they set, and in fact the precedent of having to act lawfully on that. Mr. Simelane has since gone, and with him seems to have gone the charges. I don't know what happened to those charges. I said, Chairperson, that there had been major failures in the procurement systems and poor adherence to the PFMA. We had also, very disturbingly, the levels of capitalization of the airline had been very, very poor. Yet the expectations and the opportunities for the airline had grown tremendously. But in a normal company, a shareholder would, when you have a factory and you want to grow the factory, you would need new machines because the market has opened up. Your shareholder would, in fact, be the person who would put up the money so that you can compete better and beat your competitors at the game. But that had not happened at SAA, with quite big consequences. It's a big part of how things played after SAA, and in fact today there's a similar kind of setup. There were also a number of criminal and civil claims against the airline for price fixing and anti-competitive behavior. And some of them were settled only in last few years. Chairperson, you may recall there was a settlement with Kulula, about a few $100 million actually, where SAA had behaved unlawfully. And that had just somehow not been paid any attention to, and that was one of the things we took on. We also found that the management was quite fragmented and quite disaggregated. So I'll just say there was a very poor staff morale, and with we thought, very bad tone set at the top by some of the ways in which management previously had behaved, which we thought needed to be corrected in terms of setting the tone at the top there. There was a union, there were pilots, there were just between the different levels of the workforce, there just was no team spirit. And we also found that SAA in the process had really lost a lot of scale and competitiveness, and that it all had to do with the fleet that we had. There was, a whole lot of modern aircraft that had come onto the market that was fuel efficient, much more fuel efficient. The whole offering on board of the airlines had changed, the in-flight entertainment, the leg room, all sorts of things. And SAA had just not held pace with that. That had not been dealt with. But most importantly, given the location of South Africa, if the airlines flew anywhere outside of 6 hours of a flight, there were two implications. The one was, I think it's 8 hours in the one instance, you were what we called an end of hemisphere carrier. Unlike Emirates or Kenya or Ethiopian Air, who are in the middle of the world, you could be much more nimble-footed if there was any change in the global setup or in your strategy. You could very easily fly up or down this way or that way, whereas we were stuck at the bottom. And so much that dependent on a well-functioning national airline, and it's a matter which I still have a lot of passion about, and I think there's a lot of disinformation, but I won't bore the House with that. But save it to say that the airline was completely not with a fleet that would enable it to compete. It had lost market share and scale, and in fact, we were losing all the opportunities. So we really put forward a very strong request to the shareholder to, in fact, capitalize the airline properly. We had a very weak balance sheet at the time, which just meant that we were in very bad debt. And if we wanted to borrow money in the market, in the financial markets, to grow, it would come at an extortionate rate, because it's a very simple thing. If you were bankrupt, virtually bankrupt, you would have to, you pay much more than if you have a sound one. And if you have a shareholder who indicates a willingness to, in fact, step up to the plate to enable you to grow, to give you the tools and the money to be able to grow and expand, you're much more likely to attract favorable terms for that. We were also thought that our fleet, as it was, were either very small aircraft that could only fly domestically, or otherwise ones that could only fly to Europe, to long haul. Whereas, in fact, at that stage, it was very clear, but not, apparently hadn't become obvious, but it was very clear the growth for us was into Africa. And the idea was to, in fact, use Johannesburg in particular as a hub that will enable us to do shorter flights into Africa. There was no one who could compete with us on the entire continent in terms of the access we had also into Latin America. And at that stage, we found the emergence of what has become BRICS. And so our whole strategy was to have a fleet that would enable us to fly from the east, bring passengers from China and from India and surrounding countries there through South Africa, and to connect them onward into Africa and into the Americas. And that was a sweet spot that would be us, not even Ethiopian or Kenya at the time. And so, but we needed a mix of aircraft that would enable us to do that. Another part of our strategy that we identified as a weakness was, in fact, the fact that we needed to develop a very different approach to only seeing ourselves flying as we call it, point to point, and in fact to develop Johannesburg as a hub. The Mumbai route, Chairperson, which is one matter I'll just speak to a little bit very briefly, was particularly important for us in that expansion of what we call the East-West corridor, bringing passengers from Mumbai and Beijing were our two key markets, where South Africa as a country was growing its own trade, and those same people we were trading with were people who were also trading into Africa. And so it was a very important one for us to, in fact, connect major global flows of trade through Johannesburg as a hub. And that was the significance for us at the time of building up the Mumbai route, Chairperson.
You referred to a CEO of SAA who was there before the time of your board. I see in paragraph 8